Welcome to this Axiomatics webinar. Get started now with attribute-based access control for applications using the XACML standard, Extensible Access Control Markup Language. Today, as usual with all our webinars, we have some guidelines to start with. You are all centrally muted for the sake of sound quality. The webinar is being recorded and we will provide it online afterwards, together with the slides that you then will be able to download. If you have questions during the webinar, you can use the chat box in your GoToWebinar software. Today's speakers, I'm Finn Frisch, not on this slide. With me, I have Sridhit, Nair, and Saravana, who will guide us through some of the new features in our APS product. If you want to ask us questions, you can do that by tweeting or use the chat box, and you can also of course use the XACML hashtag and find us on Twitter with our address. Today's webinar has mainly three topics. So first of all, we're going to talk a bit about why we see this hype around attribute-based access control, why the standard XACML sort of responds to urgent needs. Then we will look at new features in Axiomatics Policy Server 5.3, namely explicitly the features that enable you to do authorization on SQL requests. And lastly, we will look at the new edition of Axiomatics Policy Server, the Express edition, that will help you get started in minutes with attribute-based access control. In this new environment that we see that our customers are building, we use private clouds, public clouds, lots of combinations, together, of course, with the good old data centers. Users use different devices. They come in with all sorts of equipment. So it is becoming a huge challenge to understand where do we need to stop access and where can we let people move ahead. So the connectivity as such, access from anywhere and to anywhere, the different channels via which you get to data, together with the move to bringing your own device, all of these things cause challenges since our existing access control models are too static and unable to cope with this new highly dynamic environment. So what we see is a set of new requirements on access control models to service this new dynamic web. They need to be more flexible, they need to be dynamic, and they need to be precise. And with precise, I mean we need to take more things into account than just the roles of user that we typically have based authorization on in the past. We need to be able to take many factors: where you come from, which device you were using, time of day, location, all sorts of things that need to be considered. So legacy access control methods have been typically too coarse-grained. Very often in applications today, you log in, you authenticate, and thereafter you can gain access to everything. So there is no authorization. There's only a question about who you are, but not a question about what you are allowed to do within the application. So you gain access to everything, or you gain access to nothing. And of course, there are also authorization models inside the product that may be a bit more intelligent, but it's still too little. It says, you get too much or too little. So we need to move towards a model that allow us to make intelligent decisions based on the context in which user is trying to access information. Based on that decision, then say, okay, go ahead, or deny or grant access. And that is very much what attribute-based access control is about. And I think this is also why we see such an interest in it. We have a short timeline here. The Federal Identity and Credentials Access Management program, which is something that the US government launched some years ago, has been showing a great interest in attribute-based access control, a bit from a different angle than the XACML standard originally, but recommending that attributes be used and consolidated to enable sharing of information across government agencies. We saw the new version, the version 3.0 of the extensible access control markup language coming out in 2013. NIST came out with its guide on ABAC in 2014. And lastly, what we have been retweeting and presenting a couple of times is the prediction from Gartner recently that by 2020, 70% of all businesses will use ABAC as the dominant mechanism to protect critical assets, up from 5% today. Now, all of this sort of reflects the need for a new authorization model that we see. Our mission at Axiomatics in this is to, since we're focusing strongly on attribute-based access control, is to simplify the adoption of ABAC, to broaden the scope of use cases in which XACML can play a role, and of course to provide efficient toolboxes so it becomes easy to deploy new XACML-based services. Some of the initiatives that we have taken in this field down here, Alpha, the Axiomatics language for authorization, is a high-level language that simplifies the authoring of XACML policies. So that's in the Simplify group. Our PEP SDKs for .NET and Java respectively. The .NET can be equipped also, you can with an add-on where you can purchase a embedded .NET PDP that is also to provide toolboxes for developers. Today in this webinar we'll focus on the Express Edition, which is a new product release of our Axiomatics Policy Server product, and we will also look at the new features in our standard edition of APS. So Saravana and Srijit will guide us through these products a bit to have a look at things that we do there to broaden the scope of XACML applicability. That's the purpose of the SQL extension, and to simplify adoption is the purpose of the Express Edition, I'd say. So what is authorization for applications all about? We have all these different applications. People are coming from everywhere and via all sorts of devices. And at a central point, we need to determine whether or not access should be allowed. Just very briefly, we are using then the XACML standard for everything. And I think most of you are probably familiar with it. Just a brief recap. The standard has these various P components. The policy enforcement point is the thing that sort of intercepts a request for data, transfers that request to a policy decision point, asking, is this user allowed to do what the user is trying to do? The policy decision point may reach out to policy information points, that is finding attributes and data in external sources. It will read its policies from a policy retrieval point. These policies in turn have been authored in a policy administration point. So these are the various components of the XACML standard. Now, when we talk about the standard, we talk about a standard that defines three things. First of all, it's the request response protocol. That's one part of the standard. Secondly, it's the policy language. That's another part of the standard. Thirdly, it is this reference architecture as such is also part of the standard. And everything we do at Axiomatics has of its basis in this standard. So again, if we return to the challenging picture with the anywhere computing, we see these different enforcement points that capture requests all over. So they are captured and then checked against corporate policies, and we return a permit or deny decision, which then will control whether or not users gain access. let's turn to the product Axiomatics Policy Server. What it does then is exactly what we just talked about. It will capture the request. It will query its access control engine, an authorization service, and then it will enforce the permit or deny. There's an additional possibility here. We could have the same thing, we capture, we query the engine, and here in the step 3, the engine reaches out to additional attribute sources. Those were the policy information points in the standard, right? And then finally, we return the permit deny. Step number 3 here is extremely important. It actually turns an XACML-based solution into an integration module as well. So you integrate different applications and you have the ability to say that access can be granted or denied in application A based on the state of data in application B. So this type of integration becomes extremely powerful. The Axiomatics Policy Server product basically has 2 parts. To the left on this image, we see the box that represents the Services Manager. The Services Manager is where we centrally manage policies, attributes, and the attribute sources, the policy information points, the connectors to them. On the left, on the right-hand side, we have the various authorization domains where we deploy the authorization services. And this is highly distributed and can be, so we have some of our large customers may have authorization domains in different parts of the world managed centrally from one point. So from the central administration interface, you ship out sort of the configurations with policies and attributes into the domain. All the services within one domain share the same policies and configurations. So to set up a attribute-based access control system this way, you need to go through the following steps. First of all, we need to write the policies, and we need to collect a dictionary of the attributes that these policies require. So that we do in step 1. Then we need to distribute, we need to sort of create our authorization domains and deploy our authorization services into these domains. We then need to configure the policy information points, the attribute sources, and lastly, connect our applications to this infrastructure to get permit deny decisions. So the product sort of provides features corresponding to this. First of all, we have the authoring tools, the alpha tool, and the policy administration point, which is a rich editor for XACML policies. The services manager that distributes the policies and the configurations to the domains. And then lastly, the various APIs and SDKs that you can use for the connectivity to connect your PIPs and your policy enforcement points. So that was the quick overview of the product. Now we're getting to new features, and I'm turning to Saravana, who will help us sort of sort this out. Up until the last version of Axiomatics Policy Server, the only thing that we had was a PDP, an XACML conformant PDP that would respond to XACML requests. And now we've added new capabilities. So we have the SQL authorization as well. And then we have something that we call the ARC thingy here. We won't touch upon that because that's for pretty advanced use cases, and typically we recommend that be used with professional services. But today we're going to talk about the 2 first ones and compare them a bit. So Saravana, could you help us sort this out a bit?
Yes. As Finn mentioned, previous to 5.3 version of APS, we had the XACML PDP authorization, which was explained by Finn. Like, for example, can a particular user A access a record number 22, and the PDP will give you a decision permit or deny based on the XACML policy. Now we introduced a reverse way of asking a question, like you can set few of the attributes and you don't know some of the attributes, and you can ask queries on how can I get a permission. For example, which records the particular user may access. So in this case, you are asking the question on the records. What the SQL authorization service will provide you is the conditions on the user so that he can access the records. For example, the user A may access the record if the record location is same as the user location. So what will it will produce a SQL query, something like select records from the records table where the record location is equal to Alabama if the user location is Alabama. So it will use the same XACML architecture. It uses the policy information point to get the information about the user. Like if the user EA logs in, then the location of the user is fetched and the policy is evaluated as much as I can, and it produces the conditions based on the same XACML policy which was used for the PDP authorization.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you, Sarvan. So let's jump in and look in the services manager interface. I hope I have that loaded here. Right. So here we have it. And what has changed since the previous version? Here we had simply a PDP, and now we have these different little boxes.
Yes. Earlier you just have the how the PDP status is, whether it is in a serviceable state or an outdated state and those things. Now you have capabilities like whether you have the PDP capability on or raw capability, which is the advanced thing which Finn mentioned. The third one is the SQL capability. You can see P, R, and S. In this first authorization domain is now have only the PDP authorization capability enabled. So how to turn it on? So if you click on that, then the configuration part will be enabled and you can turn on the capability and you can select the other information, and if you press on apply, then the capability is now turned on. So all the authorization services which belongs to this particular domain can provide the SQL authorization service from now on.
Cool. So basically, we still have one authorization service, and but we can ask different types of questions.
Exactly.
Powerful. Okay. I hope that was clear. So I think this is all we need to show in the interface now, yes. Right? So we'll go back to our presentation slides. And Saravana, if you could help us. So we have in the documentation, there's one sample, I think. Perhaps yes. We should walk through that too.
Yeah, it's a small example of how this SQL authorization service can be used. As I explained, this is a CRM example, which is a customer relationship management. The policy, the XACML policy contains 3 rules, which says a particular user can access a client account if the client account is not restricted, or if the user is the one who covers that particular client account, or if the user is the manager of the person who is covering that client account. Only these 3 possible cases, the particular client is accessible by the user.
Okay. So we have the database structure here.
Yeah. So in this case, you have all the information in the database. So you can see there is a table which contains a list of users and another table which contains a list of clients and whether the client is restricted or not. There is a relations table covers which contains the relationship between the user and the client, whether the particular user covers that client or not. And there is another relationship table, managers, which contains who is supervising whom. So these are the tables in the database schema, and the SDK which we provide along with the APIs will allow you to create a query which is similar to a high-level SQL. Here you can see that it's a Java code. You create an instance of the builder, which will help you to add a fluent interface, use a fluent interface to build the query. Here you can select what attribute you want to select. In this case, I want to list the resources, so I'm using select the resource attribute, and I'm providing that the subject ID is Alice. So the user is Alice, that's what I'm providing. And I want the decision as permit. And I want the SQL output in the form of Oracle dialect, which is compliant to Oracle dialect. So here you can specify whatever the database dialect you want. We support many dialects. So if you provide Oracle, then the SQL produced is compatible with the Oracle database. If you provide SQL Server, then it is compatible with SQL Server database. And the transaction ID is useful for auditing and logging purposes. Like if you want more than one query on a single transaction, and for later auditing, you can use this information for collaborating all the transactions which belongs to the single thing. And once you give the build request, then the whole request is sent to the authorization service, and it will provide you the full-blown SQL query, which can be run against the database.
Okay. So now, so I get this right. This is a part of the PEP SDK then that our users our developers are using.
Exactly.
And if I were to change, if I say here for decisions deny instead,
then it will say that what are the clients the user Alice cannot access.
Okay.
So this can be used for auditing purposes, the authorization service.
Okay. And if I were to say select and then define sort of the clients in Alabama and leave out Alice, would I then get all the users that can get to Alabama clients?
Exactly.
Okay, so it's very flexible. You can ask in different ways.
Yes, and based on the input, it will generate the SQL query dynamically. For example, the input may be different. You may want instead of resource ID, you can ask for resource location if it is available in your database, and you can further restrict the query by saying provided the subject location is this, provided the subject department is this. So if you provide those information, then the query will restrict the the client information which according to those attributes.
Okay, cool.
Sarona, one quick question that a lot of viewers may be having is how would you compare this against a multiple decision profile that XACML provides? So in XACML we have this concept of multiple decisions where you ask multiple questions. So can we use the same thing for doing something similar, or what would be the kind of advantage of using the SQL's authorization service instead of MDP request per se?
So MDP request is something like you will provide instead of multiple requests, you compress the request and send it as a single request. So you will set, for example, if you want to provide send get the list of resources you want to get, then you will say resources as a list, resource 1, resource 2, resource 100 up to resource 100, and you will provide the subject as Alice. So the XACML optimizes that request and send you a list of decisions: permit for resource 1, permit for resource 2, permit for resource 3, and deny for resource 4. Then the PEP, the policy enforcement point, has to pass that response and see which are the resources permitted and which are the resources not permitted. But in the case of Arc SQL authorization service, it will give you a SQL query and you will run it against the database, and it will give you the list of resources the particular user is permitted to access. The query can also be reversed in this case. You can select the subject and provide the resource. So it will give you a list of users who can access the particular client.
Cool.
So it is very flexible and it's very easy, and the performance is very high if you go for like millions of records. If you have millions of records and if you want to use multiple decision profile, then you will, even though it is the request is single, but the decision will be computed for 1 million resource, which will take a lot of time. And the response has to be processed by the policy enforcement point and check what are the resources which is permitted and which is not permitted.
Right. So basically, if we have a database with 5 million records, that is not doable with a multiple request. Right?
It is doable, but you have to wait an eternity to get the result back.
Okay. Okay. So let's look. If we send this query then exactly as is, we get the following SQL back, right?
Yes, this is the SQL back, which from the SQL authorization service. Here you can see that there is an exact correlation between the rules in the XACML policy and the SQL query. The line number 3 says that if the client is is not restricted, that attribute is false. And the fourth line says that Alice is in the list of users covering that particular client. Then gather those client IDs. And the line number 5 says that um, here you can see that user ID in Paul or John. So the Paul and John are the subordinates of Alice. So this is resolved by the PIP, the policy information point. There is a policy information point configured to give the list of subordinates for the given subject. So this is dynamically changed. Like if you give user instead of Alice, if you give Bob, then the subordinate list of that particular user will be listed. The query will contain those users, not Paul and John. So the fifth line says that if the uh, user covering that particular client is in the list of Paul and John, then gather those client ID, and it will list the IDs as an output. So
And we so basically, otherwise, if we did not automate this, if you were to do this sort of in the traditional way, which many developers do, sort of build their SQL requests manually, sort of, or in code, they would have to shoot two requests. First, finding where are my subordinates, and then construct dynamically the something. And APS does this on the fly then.
Yes, it does this on the fly. And one more thing is, if we are externalizing the authorization policies outside the application, if you have to develop these queries automatically within your application, you are inserting your logic, your business logic into the application. So whenever the policy changes at the business level, you have to change the application. If there are 100 applications which contains the business logic, then you have to change 100 applications and test all the 100 applications whether it is complying to the policy.
So Saravana, this is an extremely interesting point. So we said before the standardizes three things: XACML policies, the request response, and the architecture.
Yes.
And here we have deviated from the standard in one respect, right?
Exactly. The policy and the architecture is exactly the same, but the request and response has been changed. The request and response earlier, it is changed a bit in the request, because in the request you are not providing all the attributes which you will provide only the attributes and leave the rest. And the response, instead of a permit, deny, or a not applicable or indeterminate, what you get is a full-blown SQL query which can be run against database.
Cool.
But it is fully compliant with the policy and the architecture. The policy is still the same XACML policy, and the architecture is still the same. There will be a PEP will be intercepting the request and send it to the, instead of PDP, it is the SQL authorization service.
Right. Yeah.
So, and it will provide the response.
I think one more point that is important to note here, I think, is when these queries are made, this is from the application side, right? So this is, as an application developer, in my application, I want to shoot SQL statements to the database.
Exactly.
I use this to get to the SQL that my user is allowed sort of.
Yes.
Right. So it's still, we're still in the realm of authorization for applications.
Yes.
And this is a tool for application developers.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you very much, Saravan. I believe with this we have sort of a very good overview of what this new SQL capability in Axiomatics Policy Server 5.3 provides. And with that, I think we were done with the SQL part. We'll go into the next portion now of our webinar, where we will look at the product that is just about to be released very soon, which is Axiomatics Policy Server Express Edition. Available any day now, I think. Sridhar, you have been the product manager for this. Will you please guide us through what were the main objectives for this?
Sure, Finn. So thank you very much. As you would expect from the name Express Edition, the main idea behind this in a way, repackaging of Axiomatics Policy Server, the original version, was to make it as easily deployable as possible, so that when somebody wants to try authorization in a limited scope, they would be able to get things up and running very quickly, instead of having to spend a bit more time to run and deploy the whole thing at an enterprise scale for a whole organization or a whole bigger project. That was the main goal behind getting the Express Edition version of Axiomatics Policy Server out.
Okay. And this then is sort of the high level view of what the package contains, right? So we have
Yep.
we ship this with pre-configured Tomcat servers. That's the difference, right?
That's one of the differences. So what we have in, as you would see from one of the other slides, the following slide, the non-enterprise edition, non-express edition, then the full-scale express edition supports Tomcat and WebSphere, while the express edition has an embedded Tomcat installation, which makes it easy to get it up and running without having to download and configure Tomcat separately.
Okay. So should we look at the differences?
Sure. Let me take you through the differences. The enterprise or the standard edition of APS, as I said, supports WebSphere and Tomcat servers for hosting the ASM and the PDPs or any other applications you have in mind to couple with these services. While for Express Edition, it comes pre-configured using the bundle Tomcat. We have an installer which we have added as an extra component in the Express Edition, which allows you to configure the specifications for the Tomcat service. In addition, one of the constraints we have put in terms of the scope is that because we expect these Express Edition to be used typically in a smaller scope of the project, we think that it will be usually used in a single production domain. So the idea is you use it within a single application, or at least a set of applications which have the similar policies and policy information points to be queried and so on. While for the standard editions, you can have unlimited number of domains, depending upon how you want to structure your domains, maybe one per OUCs or one per project or whatever. The third big difference is that while the standard edition supports the SQL authorization service that Saravana just mentioned, the Express editions is mainly catered for the traditional XACML 3.0 request response questions and the policies associated with them. So if you want to have a simple installation, easy to install setup with a specific application in mind and only wanting to use the PDP element of the authorization services we have, Express Edition would be the right place to go. And again, in terms of scaling, because it's for single set of applications, we limit the number of PDPs that you can use it against to in a single domain that is supported. Two, mainly because you can have some level of high availability and failovers. So if one of the PDPs go down, you still have an option of having a standby PDP that can then be brought up. So that is the main differences between Express and Standard Edition of our products, Axiomatics Policy Server.
Cool. Okay. Very good. And Sridhar, I think we're now still then waiting for the motivation behind the name, Express Edition. We want to see proof. So I suggest if we turn over to I think you can help us go through the.
You should be able to see my screen now with the APS Express Edition installer. Could you just confirm that, Finn?
Yes, we can see your screen. Yeah.
Perfect. So as I mentioned, the whole idea behind Express Edition is to make it easier for somebody who wants to install and use our policy server to get started quickly. And behind that, with that in mind, we have an installer that is allows you to get the whole infrastructure up and running as quick as possible. So let me take you through the process of what it looks like to use the installer and the typical time it takes to get everything up and running. So I am going to start from scratch, at least from the very beginning, where I log into the installer. And once I am logged in the installer, you get a kind of a view of what the situation of the system looks like right now. As you can see from the status, what I've done is already configured it as an ASM plus PDP, just because it's easier to show it in the demo and not having to take time to go through the whole process. And I've filled in some values, so I won't have to type it during the demo. But the idea is you can install this setup either as a standalone ASM in a Tomcat or a standalone PDP in a Tomcat, or if you want to have everything bundled because you're trying things out or you have a very simple setup, you can have the Axiomatics Services Manager and the PDP in a single Tomcat container. For the purpose of this demo, I have set it up as an ASM and the PDP in a single Tomcat container. Well, what we also expect the user to know is to be able to install Java, and we only support Java 7 on a 64-bit machine for Oracle 7 Javas. All the Java 6 versions, OpenJDK, and 32-bit architectures are unfortunately not supported in Express edition of software. But the Enterprise edition or the Standard edition does support Java 6 and 32-bit machines in different combinations. So once we have the basic set prerequisite up and running, what we can do is go through the motion of seeing what needs to be done to install the software. The first main part of is a situation where if you want to restore an existing backup, you would be able to do that at the very beginning. The way you would do that is if there is a backup that you already have from an existing setup, you download the backup, either the database if it's an ASM, or the whole setting if it's a PDP or an ASM, and then you can use these button over here to upload your backed up information or data. Because it's the fresh install, you can easily skip that and just go through the motion of installing the rest of the settings needed. So one of the first thing you would need to do is tell Tomcat what are the ports it needs to use and the addresses it needs to use. Addresses because a machine can have multiple network interface cards, and you might want to specify exactly which of the cards you want to use. By default, you can say all. Then you have to specify some ports for HTTP, for your SSL, and your Tomcat shutdown ports. The Tomcat gets SSL enabled by default using Express Edition, so you can start using it at using a secure kind of a communication between ASM and the PDP. So what it means that if you at all you start using the HTTP port, it gets forwarded to the SSL port. So the idea behind this screen is to let the user provide the port numbers that's required. And if you are an administrator, you also have the option of installing this as a service. The good thing about installing it as a service is that for some reason, if you have to restart your bounce your server, the service component automatically restarts the Tomcat when the machine is up and running again without having to manually start it. But again, for this to be installed as a service, you need to have admin rights if you're a Windows user, or if you should be able to provide some sudo passwords if you are a Linux user. So that's the option available at that point in time. Once you have set up your Tomcat ports, you then have to upload your ASM and the PDP licenses by clicking on the button and providing the actual location where you have gotten and kept your ASM and the PDP license. Now, you might see the button called the Upload ARC licenses, and you might think, why do we have an ARC license when we knew that Express Edition didn't have ARC support? Well, our philosophy there was that we are not going to cripple the ASM and the PDP functionalities in any way other than by licenses. So if you are, for some reason, interested in the ARC part of things and you want to just do a proof of concept or something, we can still use the exposition on a case-by-case basis to set up as ARC or ARC SQL authorization service as well. But that's typically not what we use exposition for. It is mostly meant for a PDP service for typical XACML authorization questions. So once you have uploaded your ASM and the PDP licenses and they are valid, we can then proceed to the next version. Now, if you are if you're installing just the ASM or just the PDP, you would have to only upload one of those specific licenses. I am installing ASM and the PDP as a install type. That's why I get the two of the buttons. So with that uploaded license in place, if we go to the next section of the installer, this is, I would say, the most time-consuming or the complicated part of the setup, and that's where you configure your SSL for security to make sure that all the communication between the ASM and the PDP or between your PEPs and your PDPs are secure and not nobody can eavesdrop on it. So idea behind this section of the installer is you provide details about how you want to set up your SSL. So for example, the host name. In my case, I've just set it up as localhost, but you would have a fully qualified domain name that you have in where you're going to run your ASM or the PDP. The validity period of this SSL certificates, you can set it up to how much in days you want. The password that you want to use for protecting this key store, the key, the eye kind of an icon can be used to toggle the visibility of the password. Subject alternative names are useful if you are using IP addresses or if you want to specify multiple machine IP addresses for load balancing and so on with SSL enabled. And then the rest of the things are typical SSL setup details like the organization name, the unit name, city, country code, and whatever. Once you have filled these information, you click on generate certificates and keys. And once the keys are generated, you get an information that it's done, and you get to download the required trust store and the certificates. So in this case, what you have can download is a trust certificate, CA certificate that can be used for uploading into your system so as it can be trusted by the browser, or the trust storage or JKS file, which can then be used by the PEPs if it's written in Java, so that when it starts contacting the PDP, it will trust because of the certificate chain the PDP it's talking to. At the same time, if you have a second PDP, because as I said, the license allows you to support two PDPs, you will also use the same section to to download and set up the second PDP key store. Again, host names, validity, password, extra information, and then you can download the PDP's trust store, key store actually, or the CA trust store and the CA certificates. Now, once this information is in place, if you have any changes that needs to be done, if you change it, it will basically be a new installation. But the idea is once you have this up and running, you don't have to keep changing it anytime soon. So once you have the SSL capabilities defined and the exact information in place, you can then go to the next part of the information needed. Now this would be very specific to the ASM and the PDP installation if you're doing it together. The idea here is that if you have a domain and a PDP name, you can then allow the setup to do everything automatically for you. So at the end of this installation, you would be able to have an automated configuration which sets up the domain authorization domain that with the details here, and the PDP registered with that domain with that in that domain. If you are doing an ASM or a PDP install, this is not something you would see because you need to do it manually. So once you specify that, you can then specify the end host where the ASM and the PDP talks to each other. In most cases, you wouldn't have to change the value which is over here, but if you want to, you have the option of doing it. So last but not the least, when you go to the next stage, you are provided with a screen where you can define the users of the Tomcat that needs to be defined for the ASM and the PDP to work properly. The actual users and their roles are specified in the help text on the side bar of the window for the ASM and the PDP. You could manually create them one by one, provide a name, a password, and the role that's needed. Or if you are being lazy, or if you just want to have things getting up and running, you could click on the create default users, which then populates all these informations for you. You are still able to change as things that's needed. For example, when you automatically create the users, you would get a very hard password. You may not want that, or you might want to specify your own passwords. So what you could do is then click on the edit button and then quickly change the values, which is over here. So the idea is you get the passwords set up according to your IT policies, and if you want to change the name of the user, you can still do it without changing the role. But once you have set this, the Tomcat users, that's about it. You have gone through the motion of specifying the Tomcat details, the license, the keystroke, and domains because it's an ASM plus PDP install, some endpoint details, and the users. With that, you come to the end of the configuration steps, and when I click on the finish button, it's going to go into the background and create all the information you have specified into the Tomcat settings. And it will go also start the Tomcat, create the ASM files needed, the PDP files needed, and it will also create, in this case, a new authorization domain for you with the names that you specify, get the PDP up and running, register with that PDP with the domain, and have everything ready for you to use to deploy a policy into. So this, of course, would mean that there is a bit of time that would be needed to get this whole background steps up and running. If you look at the back end, you can see the things which are happening in the console. This is not something the user is expected to know anything about, but it gives you an idea behind the things which could be happening for you to understand what's the status of it. This status bar will keep rotating for a bit of time, but at the end of it, you would see the install, which is up and running with the necessary information you have specified. So while we wait for that, is there any questions that Finn or Sarona you have in mind that you want to ask about it?
Yes. So one, you said this. Can you elaborate on the single application? What was meant with that?
Okay, sure. So as you would have seen from the slides, we have the license-based restriction that we can only support one authorization domain in an express edition of the software, and that domain can only contain one PDP, or two PDPs rather, two PDPs for load balancing. So with that restrictions in place, the ideal place for using express edition would be if you want to use it with a single PEP or a couple of PEPs all talking to the same PDP, but in the same domain, which means that the domain, because it holds the policies, it holds the pip configurations. If you have multiple policies you want to deploy for multiple applications, you will need multiple domains. And because the Express Edition only supports a single domain, the ideal situation is for it to be used is if you have a single policy related to an application, or an application, a couple of applications which can still work on the same policy and so on. So if you want multiple policies, multiple applications, lot more PDPs, then you should go for the actual non-express, the enterprise edition of APS.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have come through the process of completed. So you would see that in the summary page, you get to see what has happened. You have an installation of ASM and the PDP with the endpoints that you have specified, with the users you have specified, and the password you have in mind. So I've changed that to a simple password so I can show when you want to log in. So with this, you have come to the end of the actual installer, and you can actually go and see that the installer is up and running by doing sorry, the ASM is up and running by logging into the ASM, and you go into the domains, you will see that the demo is already configured for you as a part of your initialization process. And in that domain, you already have a demo PDP, which is configured to use that domain. So that's the extra bit that the installer did for you. And of course, you can also see that the WSDL for the PDP is also available. And as you would see, that this is the WSDL that the PEP would be able to then query and then invoke the various methods available at the PDP side to actually ask for a decision on a request. So if you go back to the installer and you close there, you'll see that the Tomcat server is up and running and everything is working as expected. That gets you an Express Edition ASM and the PDP within about 5 minutes if you know exactly the information that you want to provide and set up the installer with. That's it from the demo point of view, Finn.
Beautiful. Thank you, Srejit. And I think with this, you have proven the point. Get started now. This is probably the most rapid deployment of ABAC that we've ever produced.
Yes, we have.
From Axiomatics. I think we should be humble. We said originally that our mission is to broaden the scope, to simplify, and to provide toolboxes. We need to be humble, and there are still a lot of challenges to make ABAC deployment a really smooth path, and we'll continue to work, of course, from our end on this, and there are things to be done. But I'd say I'm impressed by what you've achieved in this project, Srijit, in making the deployment a lot faster. So with this, then, we have reached the end of our webinar. Let's see if we had any more questions coming up. We have one more on the data set. So it's if you have large number of records but not in a database.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then there are virtualization solutions, and there is something called ETL solution, which can gather the data and expose it in the form of database. That is the approach we will suggest if your data is actually not existing in the database.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then these features that we did not talk about today, the ARC sort of raw could possibly also be used.
Yes,
I guess
that can also be used for the data sets which are not in the database. For example, if you have NoSQL or LDAP, SAP, whatever you call wherever your data is, you can use the ARC raw and convert the result into the language which is understandable by the data set where your data is present.
So, and another question on the SQL dialects. How do we get efficient SQL statements? How do we know that they are optimized?
We have put in a lot of research on the optimization of the SQL query, and we have performed the SQL analysis, the SQL plan, and looked into that and what are the possible ways. There is a constant structure how the SQL is generated according to the XACML policy. So we have optimized it to the maximum.
So we can trust it's fast. Very good. Okay, beautiful. So with this, we're reaching almost the end of our hour as well. So before we quit, let us remind you about our next upcoming webinar titled Protect Business Critical Data with Dynamic Authorization for Databases. Now, this is a different topic than the SQL authorization we looked at here and now, because this was from a developer perspective in the application, and this is something that we actually provide on top of databases, right? So it has nothing to do with the normal sort of APS. It's a totally new product, a different product, and it's something that is protecting the database itself, right?
Yes.
So looking forward to that. we'll have Andrew Hindle with us in that webinar. I think probably, Saravana, you will be there and help us out a bit as well. And until then, thank you for attending. Thank you for listening. And with this, we've come to the end. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.